Hey y'all, just wanted to drop in here and give a quick insight into some of the questions that I've seen in y'all's post on the IA mapping, at least your first submission of the project. Of course, as we kick this off, there was a great overview, I think, of what IA is, some helpful links and tips, but maybe just to help kind of showcase where does IA fit in the overall UX process. And so I've got a little chart here, maybe help to showcase where that fits in. Exactly. And so we talked last time we presented about IA maps is that information architecture really just serves as that blueprint for your website. And as I'm sure many of you saw as you laid out your IA map, you could start to see and visualize how the navigation is going to look, what type of content you're going to have on each individual page. And that's really the reason why we do IA mapping, why we do site mapping, is to make sure that we have an understanding, one, of what are the pages of the site, but then two, what types of content might appear on this page. And so while we're doing it in a very streamlined format here within a week and a half or so, there are entire teams dedicated to just writing content or just structuring a website. And so you're kind of getting a glimpse into that realm of what that looks like from a UXer's perspective, from a UI designer's perspective, and even in your own work and your own process of how IA mapping might come into play. And so I hope that in this assignment, you've seen that maybe just by taking a few extra minutes to think about your content, think about your navigation, it's going to really speed up once you get into wireframes and make that process that much more simplified. So as far as IA mapping goes, it kind of, if you think about it as a Venn diagram, it tries to balance, what does the user need? What am I trying to help the user accomplish on this page or help them understand? Balancing that with what exactly is the content. And like I said, when you find yourself in a professional setting, there are entire teams of people who would be dedicated to writing content, at least in my experiences. Sometimes as a designer, you ultimately end up being the content writer also, and there's a lot of different hats that you might have to play. But balancing the user's needs and expectations of what you're trying to achieve on the site or provide them with the actual content that's going to be available and the context. So what page is it on? How might they have gotten to that page? And then what content would be helpful based off those user needs. So hopefully that's helpful. And with IA mapping, you're just looking to organize and structure and label the content in an effective way, in a way that is sustainable and doesn't provide a lot of overuse of the content or regurgitation, so that the user, has impact from page to page as they navigate your product and your site. And as y'all navigated the University's Edge site, I'm sure y'all saw repeating types of content, and maybe sometimes where it was difficult to navigate. And so that's why IA mapping is so important, because it helps you before you get into the things that maybe take up a little bit more time or a little bit more nuance as it relates to wireframing and UI design. It just helps you focus on kind of the skeleton of the content, the skeleton of your site. And so let me just lay this out on a map for you. So this is actually adapted from a map that I use in my professional setting constantly to explain UX and the UI UX process and how we get from the initial kind of celebratory kickoff to launching a product. And so there are many more steps that actually kind of inlay in this if you're working with folks in the maybe on the business side of the house, or somebody who's in analysis, or if there's an actual development team dedicated to this. But this, I just think, helps illustrate the end-to-end kind of UX process, and hopefully you see how we're working through this inside of this course as well. And so it all starts off with that initial kind of business or user goals, defining your audience. So who's your audience? Where are they located at? What are their primary needs? And what are they hoping to accomplish through your site? And if you think about this project, that's kind of exactly what we did a few weeks ago. We defined who our audience was, where our apartment complex was located at, and what our purpose of it was, and what audience we were trying to build it for. And so in the professional setting, it starts with understanding those business needs and the user needs also. For instance, the business need might be that we need to increase conversion on this product by 100% or 50%. And so you balance that kind of driving financial factor with, okay, well, how do we do that from a user perspective? What's their goals? What's their needs? What audience do we want to help drive that conversion. And so it all starts with defining your audience, understanding who they are. From there, you might go into mood boards. And so that's where we were at too. We went into mood boards or competitor analysis. So there you're looking at inspiration, ideating, thinking of other concepts that might be there. Next, you go into understanding the persona and UX research. And so while these two might be interchangeable, it's not that every time you're going to repeat these, one after the other after the other. As designers, you have to be flexible sometimes. And so it might make sense to go right from defining your audience to understanding them. And so that's okay. These don't have to fall in the discovery phase one after the other. Now in solutioning, it would make sense to follow these in a precise order. But here in discovery, you might see these kind of flux and change depending on the environment or the setting. But in the personas, you want to understand your audience. So you might build out, although you defined that you're building a site for your demographic of, parents or university students. Well, in the personas and UX research, you might be asking, what are their needs? What are their wants? What other sites are they going to achieve this goal? What would be certain factors that would contribute to them, purchasing a product or choosing your apartment complex? We're actually going to dive into personas in our next project, where we're not just going to define who the audience is, but we might actually build out a little bit of who this individual is, who this audience actually is, their likes, their dislikes, their wants, their frustrations. And that's what we've talked about in the industry chats, both in industry chat number 1 and industry chat number 2. One of the important things about being a UI UX designer is being empathetic to your users' needs, but also putting yourself in their position to understand and kind of get into their brain a little bit as to, what are the things they like, dislike, get frustrated with that they are anticipating in the site. And personas and UX research is really where a lot of that work falls in. Now, next, you might be doing user journeys or experience maps. And so in project number 4, I haven't totally fleshed it out yet, but we might be getting into experience maps or journey maps where you're defining what is the audience's primary goal and how might they achieve that through the site. And then we get to site mapping and IA mapping. And so here we're trying to understand the content, balancing the content, the context, and the user's needs. And so you can see that as we're going through this course, we're incrementally layering in UI UX deliverables. And so in project number 1, we started with just kind of the basics: mood boards, wireframes, and prototypes. Then we're going into now in project 2, defining our audience, understanding who they are, where they live, what their needs are. We're doing some mood boards. Then we're going into site mapping and IA mapping. And then after that, we move into wireframing. And so why site mapping and IA mapping is such an important step before wireframing is that I think you'll see as you sit down tonight or tomorrow night, as you go to flesh out your wireframes, just how important or beneficial the step was prior to this in IA mapping, where you actually thought about the content and knew what you had to cover on each page as you go to sketch it out. And so having that defined ahead of time is always a great thing. Some of the more challenging times that I've had in my career is skipping this IA map or site map or the content portion of this process. And what tends to happen when we do that is we get to wireframing or worse, prototyping, and we're just using filler text and we don't know, what content needs to appear on the site or what the pages are. And then, in the 11th hour, a client or a business partner comes in and says that we actually don't need to include 3 pages, but we need 30 pages. And our content actually isn't, 3 paragraphs, but it's 300 paragraphs. And so knowing the complexities of your site early on through IA mapping and site mapping just helps improve the process and helps you understand and get a clear picture of what you're designing for. As you can imagine, not knowing what the content is or not knowing how many pages are going to be on your site until you actually have already designed kind of the concept really creates a challenge of rework and trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, if you will. So IA maps will be really important once we get in then to wireframes. And so you'll go into that same process that we've been doing here due on Thursday evening of sketching out your wireframes. For this project, we're focusing on desktop only. And so that will be a help. So we focus just on desktop. We're not going to worry about mobile for this project. Those wireframes inform the actual UI design. And we're actually going to create a clickable prototype in Adobe's InVision. And so if you haven't yet, please set up a free account on InVisionApp.com. It's not owned by Adobe. I misspoke there, but InVisionApp.com. Set yourself up a free account, and I'll walk through videos of how we're going to create that here in the next coming classes. Then finally, we go into testing and gathering feedback. And so while for this project, we're not going to be doing that, project number 4, it's going to be included. It's always a good idea to, after you've walked through this process, go back to those users, those personas that you've defined, and get their feedback and make sure that the product's actually working for them. After that, you might iterate on the concept and hand that off to development. Now, every team is different. And so as a designer, and if you have an affinity to be able to write code and be able to do that also, you might find yourself being the content writer, the designer, and the developer. Those are challenging times, but sometimes the designer is asked to play that role. In my experiences, those are two different skill sets. There are folks who are really good at development and front-end code, and folks who are really great at designing and creating prototypes and walking through this process from discovery to solution. And so oftentimes you might find yourself with a development partner, and having done all this work ahead of time makes this individual's job a whole lot easier once they know the content of the site, the actual prototype itself that's been iterated and tested on by the users. And then after they get it to a point where it's actually built and it's actually functioning and you can enter in text in a form field and all that, then it's great to come back and give a little bit of a UX UI review, just to ensure that these concepts that you worked on all the way back here on the left-hand side have kept their integrity all the way through to development. You know, another challenging time is when you might hand something off to a developer and it's a beautiful prototype that you've tested and you've iterated on, and it's just the most beautiful thing you've ever done. But once it gets through development, it comes out looking nothing like you designed it. And so that's why it's important to have that review process with the developer when you're in a professional setting like that. And then it gets to launch and everybody has a great time, and you may have a launch party because of it. And the beauty about the UX process, and of course we're talking about maybe how does site mapping come into play here, is that after a site's already launched, because you're putting the user first, the user's needs change. And so you get to come all the way back here to the very beginning. And if a new feature comes up or there's a new audience that you want to cater to, you start all the way back at the beginning, define your business goals, define your user needs, and you can walk through this process over and over and over again. That's what keeps products great. That's why whenever you have an iPhone app, you might see that, you know, Facebook pushed a new update or Instagram pushed a new update. It's because they've went back and they've iterated on some features and they're constantly launching product. And so there's multiple roles that play a part into that. There's business roles, design, creative roles, there's development roles, there's architecture and security roles. And so as you see yourself as a part of a greater team, or perhaps being an individual solo designer and developer hybrid in the future, hopefully this helps you to see how all these things that we're doing build upon each other to get you to a point where you have a beautiful concept, a beautiful prototype that has been thought through from start to finish, and is just a great piece to be able to inform development, or for in this case, this instance, in a university setting, academic setting, for you to have a great portfolio piece because of it. So hopefully that was helpful. I just wanted to take a few minutes, as I saw some questions come up in your submissions from Thursday night, just to talk about where does IA fit into the entire UX process, and just kind of give you a glimpse or a snapshot into this professional setting where I've used illustrations or a graphic like this to explain our UI UX process over and over again. As I think about this project, this IA map, that module that we find ourselves in tonight, just want to keep in mind and remind you all that due tonight at 11:50 p.m. is any iterations that you've made to your IA map, to your site map. Just at first glance, there's a lot of great work that's happened. There's some room for improvement also. And so hopefully this weekend we'll give some feedback, and hopefully that's valuable to you as you sit down tonight and think about the iterations and the updates you want to make to your IA map. And I hope as we go into wireframing, you'll see why this process, this step, was so valuable, because now you know exactly what you're building out for your wireframe. So you'll begin to flesh out your IA map, bring it to life, structure it visually in your wireframes, and I'm excited to see that. So hopefully this was helpful. I look forward to seeing what you submit tonight for your final IA map, and I'll talk to y'all later in some other videos. All right, thanks everybody.